Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I am the Reverend William Levwood. My pronouns are he and him. I'm affectionately known as Rev Lev, and I'm so happy to be back in the pulpit after my month of study leave. Good to be with you all. A reminder, as we always do, that if you're in person, to silence your phones, and whether you're joining us in person or online this morning, let's center ourselves for worship by taking a deep breath together. We open and welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land who live on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomic Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing, so that all together shall one day know full justice.
A joyful day, open your ears to the song, open your hearts, everyone, open your hearts, everyone, today will be a joyful change, open your hearts, everyone, don't be afraid of change, don't be afraid of some change, don't be afraid of some change. Today will be a joyful day. Don't be afraid of... Jump back to the top. And to rejoice and come in. And to rejoice and come in. Today will be a joyful day. And to rejoice and come in. Good morning. Welcome to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is Milton Nash. My pronouns are he, him, and I am so happy to be your worship associate today. If you aren't new to Accotink, look around. Do you see people you haven't met or haven't spoken to in a while? These people like you and want to meet you. So help us live up to our mission to be a welcoming and inclusive spiritual home for all by reaching out and making a connection. By visiting this congregation, newcomers are in a transition moment, and people in transitions are more open to new friendships. That means that your new best friend might be here this morning, and this is your chance to get to meet them before someone else does. So whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for our social hour online and in person immediately after this service. We're so delighted that you decided to join us today. Welcome.
It's a new month. We're in the month of August, and that means we have a different monthly theme than we had last month, although they're somewhat related. This month our theme is Foundations of Unitarian Universalism, and last month we were exploring our Unitarian Universalist journeys with reflections from many members about their UU journeys, connected to our mission statement as well. Then in September, we'll start using our Soul Matters themes again. So in September, we'll start off with building belonging, which I think is particularly needed at this time in our society, and also a foundation of Unitarian Universalism, I think, our inclusiveness and commitment to belonging for all people. So this month, though, today I'm going to talk about our justice commitment, but in the sense that we're forming society with liberating love as our guide in order that all people may flourish and thrive. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Next Sunday, we're going to look at the fact that Unitarian Universalism is really quite unique in drawing from multiple sources. Most religious traditions draw from a certain book or collection of books, but Unitarian Universalism draws from all world religions, as long as the teachings that we're drawing from align with our values, and also from non-religious sources as well, from science, from our own experience, from earth-based teachings. So we'll look at that, as well as our embrace of theological diversity. It's likely that the person sitting next to you this morning might not have the same theological viewpoint as you, and we celebrate that, and we center ourselves in values and covenant, not in creed. So we'll talk about that 2 Sundays from now. And then the third Sunday that I'm in the pulpit this month, I'll be talking about our new UU values and this acronym JETPIG. You've heard the phrase, when pigs fly. Well, we're going to talk about when jet pigs fly. But really, the idea is going to be to explore how do these values animate our life. And I use that word animate deliberately because while they are a commitment, they're also something that can give a center and enrich our lives when we focus on those values. So that's what we'll explore then. Then we're going to look at our Flaming Chalice and the history of our Flaming Chalice, which is a fascinating history, with guest preacher Emily Parker. And then Reverend Morgan McLean, who is a member here, will be doing the service our 5th Sunday, because we have 5 Sundays this month, also exploring foundations of Unitarian Universalism. So I'm excited for this month of exploration together. But we're going to talk about how we form society, and in that spirit, I invite you to rise in body or in spirit. First, we'll light our chalice, and we'll say the words of an abbreviated version of our UU values, and then we'll sing the hymn, We Would Be One. So please say with me, love is at the center of Unitarian Universalism. Love is the practice of our living tradition. As Unitarian Universalists, we covenant to help everyone flourish, honor the web of life, be beloved community, cultivate generosity, celebrate diversity, and transform the world with love.
We would be one in building for tomorrow, a nobler world than we have known today. We would be one in searching for that meaning which finds our hearts and points us on our way. As one we pledge ourselves for greater service, with love and justice strive to make us free.
My name's Michelle Anderson. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm very delighted to be with you this morning. Today we are talking about love, and there's a book that I would like to read to you called Love is Powerful, and it's by Heather Dean Brewer, and it's illustrated by Luan Pham. Mari spilled her crayons onto the table. They made a messy rainbow. "What are we coloring, Mama?" she asked. Mama smiled. "A message for the world." Mari ran to the window and pressed her nose to the glass. Far below, people walked in different directions. Buses, cars, and taxis honked and rumbled down the busy street. Mari asked, "How will the world hear?" "They'll hear," Mama said, "because love is powerful." Mari climbed onto her mama's lap. The crayon smelled sharp and new. Mama used one to write some letters. Even though Mama's words stretched across the poster, they would be too small for the world to read, Mari thought. Mari picked up a crayon. As she made her own signs, she imagined her friends in their apartments across the city. Grandma and Grandpa a plane ride away, and all the people in other countries. Do you see the signs in different languages? Mari wondered, how will the whole world see our message? Mama hugged her close. "They'll see," she said, "because love is powerful." Mama handed her a coat, and then they both laced up their shoes. Mari tucked the posters under one arm and held Mama's hand with the other. They slipped through the elevator doors. Down, down, down they went, all the way to the lobby. Mari hopped onto the sidewalk, then stopped and looked up. The street was packed with people. More people than she'd seen in her entire life. Mari tugged on Mama's arm to ask her to kneel down. Then she whispered in Mama's ear, "Mama, it's so loud, and there's so many people. They won't hear our message." Mama said, "They will, little Mari." Mama lifted Mari up, and for a moment she felt like she was flying. On top of Mama's shoulders, Mari could see the crowd swell for blocks. Hundreds and thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people marching down the street. Some held signs like Mari's, all saying different things. Everyone cheered as they walked together. Mama joined them. Mari bobbed above the crowd like a canary, fluttering over trees. She felt as tall as one of the buildings. Mari raised her sign for everyone to see. Even though she was small and the crowd very big, so big she didn't think anyone would hear, she called out her message. Can you see what it says? Say it with me. Love is powerful. Through the roar, her voice was heard, and someone shouted the message back. Mari yelled again, and more joined in. Again, she yelled the message. Let's say it all together. Love is powerful. This time, when the crowd called back, Mari's message rumbled down the street and echoed off the buildings. It was as loud as breaking waves. Smash. Let's say it together. Can you make it as loud as the breaking waves? Love is powerful. Great job. So this is a real, true story. And the little girl, Mari, was only 6 years old. But even the young can make a powerful difference when you use your heart as love. Because what? Love is powerful. Thank you so much.
What follows is an excerpt from Revolutionary Love by Valerie Carr. Authoritarianism is a method of rule that suppresses political freedoms and civil rights and concentrates power in the hands of a single leader or a small elite. Authoritarians consolidate their power through projects of dehumanization that scapegoat entire populations. Cruelty is the point. Chaos is the means. Helplessness is the desired result. They are betting that we will concede to their new world order. They are counting on our silence. That is how authoritarians win. But these are the early days of this administration. What we do right now, whether we resist or concede, determines what the United States will ultimately become. They want us to believe we are powerless, but that is a lie. The majority of us oppose authoritarianism. We are the majority. We must act like the majority. We must take courageous stands wherever we are, whoever we are, whatever that looks like for us. We must weave threads of care and protection around each other. We must resist, and we must do more than resist. We must dream of the world we want and practice that world in the space between us. Our dream must be more powerful than their nightmare. We must build communities so anchored in love, so activated by our joy, that the cruelty that drives authoritarianism cannot take root. Revolutionary love is the call of our times. Revolutionary love is the choice to see no stranger, to leave no one outside of our circle of care.
I don't know if there are youth here for the class on holy troublemakers, which is the curriculum for the youth right now, but Valerie Carr is what they'll be talking about if there is. And I have to say, my sermon won't be as good as that reading. It was pretty fabulous, wasn't it? Thank you to Milton for his recitation of it, and to Valerie Carr for those words about revolutionary love. I'm going to start by talking about, I went to Starr King School for the Ministry, which is one of only 2 Unitarian Universalist seminaries. And it's in Berkeley, California. And when I went there, it was part of the Graduate Theological Union. And that meant that we could take courses at other theological schools. There were a Lutheran school, there were a couple Catholic schools, a Baptist school. You get the idea. So I took a class in church leadership at the Lutheran seminary. And one day before class started, one of the Lutheran seminarians in training asked me, "What's Unitarian Universalism?" She said, "I don't know much about that tradition." And I realized in that moment that I actually didn't know much about Lutheranism. So I said, "I actually don't know much about Lutheranism. How would you describe Lutheranism?" And she said, "Oh, that's easy. Salvation by grace." And I thought, wow, this is not how I would have described Unitarian Universalism if I hadn't just heard her response. But given that way of thinking about it, I said Unitarian Universalism is about salvation by character. So I want to talk about that idea of salvation by character that comes from the Unitarian branch of Unitarian Universalism. So the idea, the implications of this idea of salvation by character, that we can, I guess you could say, earn salvation through how we live our lives and how we form our character over time. is rooted in the idea that humans are created in God's image and with the ability to become like God. One of the most famous theological treatises from the 19th century is from Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing, and it's called Likeness to God. So in other words, humans have the ability to be good, that God created humans this way and created a world that is also good. Because God is so loving that God created a world that is good enough that it supports human flourishing. And in many ways in our tradition, I don't know if William Ellery Channing would agree with me about this, but as we move forward in time, it definitely is true. God doesn't do a whole lot after that. This is what's called low theology. And we have high anthropological theology, or a high theological anthropology, which says that it's mostly left up to us to make the world continue to be a place where humans can flourish and thrive and be good to each other. So in many ways, this is in stark contrast to the idea of salvation by grace, the idea that original sin has distorted human beings that are created in God's image, and that sin cannot be overcome, except for the fact that luckily, in that way of looking at things, there's what's called a high theology, that God is very powerful. So even though humans has a low theological anthropology, even though humans don't have much ability to overcome that sin, they can overcome it through grace, through salvation by grace, not through human effort and mostly not through human actions, that it's not up to us or mostly not up to us, except for choosing God's grace, which does, in many Christian readings of that, transform the person in such a way that they actually also are able to comport themselves in likeness to God. So I don't want to make too stark a difference between Unitarianism and the idea of original grace, original sin and salvation by grace, but there is a difference, and I think it matters. I also realized, though, after talking to that Lutheran classmate, that we also, as Unitarian Universalists, believe in salvation by grace. That comes from our capital U Universalist tradition, which stands for universal salvation. So this is the idea, in contrast to the idea that there's a predestined elect who are predestined to choose God's grace and therefore go to heaven, that in contrast to that, God's love is so big, so huge, that salvation by grace is for absolutely everyone. And furthermore, that a reconciliation or atonement that in most forms of Christianity comes through Jesus' sacrifice, in some ways appeasing God for our sinfulness, that in contrast to that view, our Universalist tradition proposes that God loves us not regardless of our sin or because we've overcome our sin, but just because God is so loving. So sometimes people say that Unitarians and Universalists have this high view of humanity. And I think that's true, but I also think that high view of humanity comes from this very high view of God, that God's love is just so remarkable that that's why humans have been made in such a way that all of us deserve and can have salvation. Now, a small note about universalism that I think is important is that there's a debate in the 19th century about two different kinds of universalism. One in which, as soon as you die, you instantly go to heaven. The other school of thought says, we are imperfect, and we've likely done some sinful things. We probably need to spend some time in a purifying purgatory, at least most of us do, before we go to heaven. So this was a heated debate in universalism in the 19th century. And I bring it up because I once had the experience when I was a chaplain at a hospital in North Carolina where the Unitarian Universalist minister in Winston-Salem came and she did a service where she spoke about universal salvation. It was very important to her in particular as a person. And at the end, we offered to anoint people, and we said to them, "You are loved." And a lot of people came up, but not everybody came up who was at that. It was a Wednesday interfaith service. And I was talking with a chaplain colleague, a Christian chaplain colleague, an African-American man, after the service, and I was talking about the service, and I said, I actually was one of the people anointing people, so I didn't even notice whether you went up to get anointed. And he said, actually, I didn't. And I went on to talk about universalism and this difference, and that I actually like the idea of a purifying purgatory. I think it's important when you think of the enormity of oppression and violence and cruelty that humans can inflict, it can feel, to some people, unjust that you die and you instantly go to heaven. Right? So the universalism that puts forth a purifying purgatory feels like a more just universalism. Now, I don't know if that's what changed this colleague's mind, but he did ask me to anoint him after we had this further discussion about universalism. So I think it's important that we think about complexly the details of our universalism. So there's another implication of this idea of Unitarian idea of salvation by character, and also our universalist style of salvation by grace. First, let's talk about salvation by character. So over time, Unitarians noticed that when we have this idea of refining one's character through prayer, through spiritual practice, through education and lifelong learning, that this is not necessarily something that's open to all people. That not everyone in our society has the leisure time to engage in those kinds of practices, that many people's social location gets in the way of that. And I think we can think about this even with how we view morality. There are some schools of morality that suggest that you just should make the moral choice no matter what your circumstances are. But I think many of us would think differently about someone who has means and steals regardless out of greed versus someone who, say, is lacking basic needs like adequate food and steals to get that food, right? It seems like, to my mind, you might use a different stick for measuring morality depending on the circumstances. So that has influenced our understanding of salvation by grace, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Did I say salvation by grace? I meant salvation by character. I am going to talk about salvation by grace. So over time, also, Universalists become less focused on an afterlife and whether we're going to go to heaven in an afterlife. And you could say they start to see this world as the purgatory, or even they see the ways that it is, for many people, made into a hell on earth. And they decide that universal salvation might be more about making it possible for everyone to experience heaven on earth, right here, right now, than this question of whether we go to heaven after we die. So in both of these, at the time, separate traditions of Unitarianism and Universalism, they come to the conclusion that we need to make the world a place where humans can thrive and flourish. That it's not enough to just say that it's an individual's responsibility to earn salvation or to just receive grace after they die, but that it's our responsibility to make a social structure that supports thriving. In January of this year, I preached a sermon that I called "We Help Make the Garden Grow," and I called it a Unitarian Universalist creation story, because that is so fundamental to our theology, that we help to make our human social structures as if humans are the plants and the social structure is the gardener. So we want it to be good gardeners of people. So we can also look at this in psychological theory. There's a shift in psychological theory that illustrates this insight into human behavior. And author Jeffrey L. Cohen describes it this way in his book, Belonging: The Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides. He writes, that before the middle of the 20th century, the overwhelming emphasis in the field of psychology had been placed on personality, or we could even substitute character. In this way of viewing the world, he writes, an individual's behavior emanates from internal dynamics. But then he writes that the field shifted around the middle of the 20th century when psychologists discovered the powerful effect on situations on behavior. And there's now a lot of research that supports that our behavior is highly dependent on the context and the situation that we're in. Jeffrey Cohen writes, for instance, the same person might act shy in the classroom but outgoing at a sporting event. And he goes on to say that rather than explain behavior solely in terms of individuals and their proclivities, good or evil, smart or stupid, we can see situations as drawing out behavior that is good or evil, smart or stupid. So I just want to point out that Unitarian Universalism, Unitarians and Universalists, with all due respect to science, which we hold in high regard, got to this conclusion before the science of psychology did. And in response, we've been working to change the context of people's lives to alleviate poverty and other oppressive structures. In a way, it's like we turned the lens of salvation by character and applied it to society rather than just individuals. And we worked to reform the character of our society to make it better so that those social structures would encourage human beings, individuals, to be good. It's also, in this understanding, it's bad theology, or one could say bad psychological theory, that makes evil appear in the world. This gets to the authoritarianism that reading talked about. When we believe some people are destined for heaven and others for hell. In classical Unitarian and Universalist theological writings, the idea is that if you imagine a God that is going to condemn some people to hell, you're going to create a world, right? Because we're created in God's image, in which we do that right here, right now. And that we feel okay with separating people, the haves and the have-nots, the righteous and the unrighteous. And then the have-nots and the unrighteous deserve to suffer, just as they deserve to suffer for all eternity in hell. And Unitarian and Universalist theologians propose that the opposite is also true, that when we create a heaven on earth for all people, people will be more likely to thrive and flourish, that we will embody that image of God as love, and that humans will thrive, not just materially, but morally. That's why we're committed to transforming the world through liberating love. That's from our new Article 2 statements of our purpose. Included in that is the phrase that we transform the world through liberating love. So I want to take a moment to think about what does liberation mean? To ask ourselves, what causes those oppressive conditions and what does liberation look like? And I think that the biblical story of the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt is a good model to look at both the oppressive structures and the liberation from those structures. In that story, the Pharaoh has authoritarian power and enslaves a group of people and creates inequity in the society. And that group of people, and actually Pharaoh, I should add, purports himself to be a god. You could say he says things like, I can fix it all myself. And in contrast, Moses proposes a different kind of God that isn't in human form, but that we can embody to make a different kind of society. And he tells Pharaoh to liberate the children of Israel, and then they just leave, right, when Pharaoh refuses to do that, even after It's striking, even after all these plagues and suffering are sent, he still holds on to that power. And then we have this idea of the promised land and the desert, where we transform human society into a more egalitarian and more loving and more just society, and then enter a promised land as a reward for that. Now, I want to point out that a couple things about the promised land. As a physical reality, that idea turns out to be rather problematic. We can see historically that claiming a promised land, as many settlers described the United States of America, can lead to conquering, displacement, and the near genocide of the people already inhabiting that land. And I just want to point out there's little to no archaeological evidence that anyone ever conquered the promised land of Israel in our historical past. It's much more likely that the promised land in reality was only ever an inspiring metaphor for an oppressed people about how that oppressed people could transform oppressive conditions into liberated ones. And that is, I think, a good model for us. And we see that model used also of the promised land as a way of being rather than a place in the civil rights movement. And it's why we as Unitarian Universalists are committed to transforming the world through liberating love. A liberating love that dismantles oppressive structures put in place by authoritarian elites. It's not easy work, especially not right now. But I think if we're honest, we have to admit that there was rising inequality. Wealth inequality in particular has risen dramatically over the past 50 years, even before the recent rise of today's wannabe pharaoh. And that this rising inequality was put in place by an oligarchy, a group of pharaohs. And that this has happened throughout society, over and over and over again. And it's up to people who usually are the majority to wake up and liberate ourselves from these oppressors. I want to bring us back to this idea that love is powerful. That it's God as liberating love that we put our commitment and our faith in. And that if there is any such thing as original sin in Unitarian Universalism, it's the counter idea that love is not at the center, that oppressive power is at the center, that Mike makes right, that this pharaonic viewpoint is at the center. But I think the message of Unitarian Universalism and the message of Moses and the message of Jesus, and for me, the message of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, in fact, is in asserting that the power of liberating love is the true power, is the true God. Muslims say, Allahu Akbar, God is greatest, or God is greater than any other power. Can we say it one more time together from the picture book? Love is powerful. So may we be among those who wake up and work to liberate ourselves and others from oppression. May it be so, and may we be among those who transform the world through liberating love into a place where all thrive and flourish. Amen, 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 and blessed be.
Please rise now in body or in spirit and join us in our closing words. As we extinguish our chalice, I invite you to join me now in our community blessing with these words of David Bumbauer, slightly adapted. This church is dedicated to the proposition that by celebrating our differences and embracing our diversity, we honor the unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time, death, and the space between the stars. We pause now and silent witness to that unity. Now that we've gathered together in this welcoming and inclusive spiritual home, let us go out into the world inspired to share our values.